Welcome to Arundel, one of the most charming towns in the beautiful West Sussex countryside. Best known for its immense castle that we can see peering above the trees in the distance, Arundel is filled to the brim with history on every corner. And on this walk around the town on a beautiful summer's afternoon, we'll not just take in views of the town's sprawling castle from a number of different angles, but we'll also admire the tranquil scene of Arundel's more than 700-year-old Parish Church, uncover the history of bustling medieval trade on the banks of the River Arun, explore the town's beautiful old marketplace, and gaze up at the imposing and spectacular Arundel Cathedral, located at the top of the town. All of that is to come over the next 25 minutes, but we begin our walk looking towards the town from the historic Arundel Bridge, which spans the River Arun beneath us. Some say that the Arun is the origin for this historic town's name, Arundel possibly deriving from the term Arundale, either referring to a tidal valley, or more likely, a valley of horehounds, a type of plant which grows plentifully along the river's 37-mile course, which runs entirely within the historic county of Sussex. As we'll explore in more detail a little later on, the River Arun was also once a vital feature of this historic countryside town, which developed as a significant inland port for boats entering the country from the English Channel, located just a few miles downstream at the mouth of the river near the coastal town of Littlehampton. But there's much more to Arundel's history than that. And long before its emergence as a port, this town was the site of a number of fascinating medieval landmarks. Just here on the banks of the river, we're passing by the ruins of Blackfriars, a historic monastery that was founded here back in the year 1253, and which existed for nearly 300 years before its dissolution at the hands of King Henry VIII in the 16th century. But why did a community of friars decide to establish a monastery on the banks of the Arun in the middle of the Sussex countryside? Well, that decision was likely in no small part driven by the presence of one of the most significant fortresses in all of southern England, the mighty Arundel Castle. With a history dating back nearly 1,000 years to the immediate aftermath of William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings, Arundel Castle is today widely regarded as one of the most beautiful castles in the entire country. And these, the castle's imposing bridge gates, are just one tiny portion of an immense fortress that's almost as big as the town surrounding it. These grand gates today serve as the main visitor entrance to the castle, although they're actually one of Arundel Castle's newest features, built less than 200 years ago in the mid-19th century, during a period of sprawling redevelopment and restoration to this historic castle, which looks entirely different today to how it began life, originally built as a much smaller wooden fortress back in the late 11th century. A visit to Arundel certainly isn't complete without a visit to the castle and its sprawling grounds, which interestingly serve not only as a tourist attraction, but still act as the official residence of the Earls of Arundel and the Dukes of Norfolk, among the oldest and highest-ranking titles in the English nobility. Having undergone a number of fierce sieges through its history, Arundel Castle also possesses a rich military heritage, while in recent years it's also made a name as a popular filming location for movies and TV shows, often acting as a double for the even larger Windsor Castle further to the north. Now, we won't have the chance to venture inside the castle on our walk today, though given its size and the way it absolutely dominates the town, we'll be passing by its walls and gates many more times as we make our way through the heart of Arundel. But let's now turn our attention back across the road towards the banks of the River Arun. Skirting along the eastern edge of the historic town centre, the Arun originally served as a small natural boundary at the foot of the castle, and for much of Arundel's early history, the only way across was by using a small ferry boat that would have operated roughly where the modern bridge, which was built back in 1850, stands today. Originally, in the era when the castle was first built, boats generally struggled to navigate up the river as far as Arundel here, Although, as you might be able to see along the sides of the river's course, over the centuries it was manually straightened and even widened in parts, so that vessels could reach this point. Though navigable even further north, most boats tend to end their journeys at Arundel Bridge here. And interestingly, the predecessor to the current bridge, which was built back in the 1720s, was actually constructed using many of the stones from the old monastery of Blackfriars, one of the reasons that it stands in such a ruinous state today. Despite its broken remains, there's plenty more history behind Blackfriars there. In fact, for many years, the ruins beside the river were actually thought to belong not to an old monastery, but another medieval religious establishment, known as the Maison Dieu, and many Arundel locals still refer to Blackfriars as the Maison Dieu, even though that was discovered to actually have been located further up the hill beside the Parish Church. We'll venture up towards the top of the hill at the end of our walk, but here we find ourselves walking away from the river onto the High Street, busy with traffic on this afternoon, but which is also lined with a collection of fetching timber-framed buildings, today playing host to the local post office, an antique shop, and more. But as we now venture deeper into the heart of Arundel, let's take a brief look at a map of the local area to get a better idea of exactly where this historic town is located. As we've mentioned, Arundel lies in the heart of the West Sussex countryside, just on the southern edge of the hilly South Downs that span the width of the county, and just over 3 miles away from the English Channel too, a stretch of coastline where you'll find major seaside towns like Littlehampton, Worthing and Bognor Regis. Centuries ago, Arundel here was more significant than all of those towns put together, as the area's premier port and economic centre, much of the historic land-based trade taking place just here on the historic marketplace. The centre of the old marketplace is today marked with the town's war memorial, unveiled back in 1921 to pay tribute to the locals who lost their lives fighting in the 2 World Wars. While the rest of this historic trading venue is decked out in some eye-catching red, white and blue bunting, while a Union flag flies high at the top of a tall flagpole just above us here. All these decorations certainly add a nice splash of colour to Arundel's old marketplace, which sits at the foot of the increasingly steep route between the river crossing and the top of the hill up there. A route that's lined by a variety of historic buildings that date back centuries, many of which play host to historic pubs and taverns long used by travellers passing through this historically significant market town. As we mentioned, we'll climb up the steep upper part of the High Street towards Yetmore Castle gates, the Parish Church, and the spectacular Arundel Cathedral in a few minutes' time. But before we do that, we're going to make our way back down towards the Riverside once again, where we'll find yet more intriguing clues as to this town's lengthy history. This small road leading back towards the River Arun is also part of the High Street, and just on the corner of the street, we find one of Arundel's largest town centre pubs, the Swan Hotel. Now, this inn has a history dating back to 1759, and it's no coincidence that it's situated here at the bottom of the High Street by the river, on a site that overlooked what was once upon a time Arundel's bustling town quay. As we mentioned earlier, Arundel historically existed as a significant inland port, and it was on this side of the historic bridge, typically the upper reaches of the river navigable by trading vessels, that the town was brimming with activity. Arundel's history as a port goes back to its earliest days, first officially registered as a place of maritime trade in the year 1071. And for over 800 years from that point onwards, the river here would have been packed with ships big and small offloading goods onto the historic town wharves, wooden landing jetties that lined the banks of the river just here, with everything from coal to timber, fish, stone and more brought into this town by boats. Today the river is rather calmer, but overlooking it just here we find the town's striking coat of arms, which is packed with icons of the town's rich history, most notably including 3 martlets on a gold field, these being a type of heraldic swallow which serve as the symbol of Arundel. You might be wondering why swallows are used to represent this town, and the fact is that it's simply thought to be a clever bit of wordplay on the town's name. because in the French language, once commonly spoken by the English nobility, the word for swallow is hirondelle, which sounds a bit like Arundel. Of course, for much of the town's history, it was widely known as a major port, which reached its peak sometime around the 16th century, but which continued to engage in maritime trade until as late as the early 20th century. And throughout all that time, the bustling port industry brought in not just goods, but people from all across England, and more widely, Europe. People who'd often need somewhere to rest, or simply get a drink before heading back out to sea. The building in front of us here was once upon a time the Crown Inn, one of as many as 30 pubs that once existed in this town. And although it and the vast majority of Arundel's historic taverns eventually closed down with the decline of the port, a few still remain, including the Red Lion here on the Market Square. The Red Lion opened its doors more than 300 years ago, back in the 17th century, and ever since then it's continued to serve the residents of Arundel, as well as the thousands of people who've passed through this town. But the pub is far from the only historic building surrounding this central town square. Just across the road beyond the War Memorial, there stands a row of even more beautiful shops. The black and white timber-framed house on the right, possibly dating back as far as the 16th century, while its taller brick-built neighbours are even older, dating at their oldest to the late 14th century. There's quite the architectural feast here in the heart of Arundel's High Street, but there's also yet another historic pub to be found here, the huge Norfolk Arms, especially distinctive for the large opening in its ground floor that was historically used by horse and carriages stopping off at the tavern while passing through town. This pub is slightly younger than the Red Lion back across the road, as it was opened back in 1783 by none other than the Duke of Norfolk, who resided inside the castle located directly behind this row of beautiful buildings. But it doesn't stop there, because facing this row of buildings across the high street once again, we see a striking but deceivingly young black and white house, which was interestingly built just over 100 years ago at the turn of the 20th century, and which until as recently as 1996 served as the publishing house of the West Sussex Gazette, the historic local newspaper. Speaking of West Sussex, the county in which Arundel is located, this historic town is second only to the county town of Chichester, about 10 miles to the west, in its wealth of historic landmarks, with well over 100 listed buildings to be found on the streets of Arundel. We of course won't be able to dive into the histories of each and every one today, but there are few listed buildings more significant than the one which absolutely dominates the town, which we can see once again running up the slope of the high street across the road here. Now, interestingly, these walls running along the high street are another of Arundel Castle's newer features. Once upon a time, this part of the road was actually open to the public, but in the mid-19th century, the Duke of Norfolk, owner of the castle, wanted to enclose this part of the street within his castle walls, doing so in exchange for the construction of a new town hall, which we'll see in a moment. Before these walls closed off this part of the high street to the public though, this upper part of the road would have been busy with people engaging in business related to the port down at the bottom of the hill. And it was only in the 19th century that that historically bustling industry began to decline in this town. Despite Arundel's historic dominance of trade in this area of Sussex, throughout the 19th century, the nearby town of Littlehampton, directly on the coast, began to rapidly grow in size. And despite efforts by the residents of Arundel to prevent its rise, it soon became the main port in this part of Sussex, with the old customs house, that was once stationed up at the northern part of the High Street too, shutting its doors in 1850, and moving down to Littlehampton. But as we know from the success of tourism in the modern day, the loss of the port was no death knell for the local community, and Arundel remains a bustling and wonderful place to be, even today. Here, meanwhile, we've briefly ventured off the high street onto a road known as Maltravers Street, which is home to Arundel's Grand Victorian Town Hall. As we just mentioned, this town hall, built back in 1838, was part of an exchange deal between the town and the Duke of Norfolk for the enclosure of the Upper High Street as well as the old Fitzalan chapel further up the hill within his castle walls. Though it might seem strange to think that the townspeople would have agreed to lose quite a significant chunk of publicly accessible land from their streets, the deal was mutually beneficial, because this modern town hall, still in use today, replaced a much older 16th century town hall that used to stand in the middle of the High Street, between the Norfolk Arms Hotel and the old publishing house of the West Sussex Gazette. Despite standing slap bang in the middle of the town's main road, the old town hall fell into neglect, and it was demolished back in the 1740s, leaving Arundel without an official town hall for the best part of a century, until the Duke of Norfolk agreed to fund the building that stands on Maltravers Street today. And as we now return to the High Street, this successful exchange is just one of many examples of the town and the castle working together in unison. In fact, throughout Arundel's history, the dukes and earls who resided at the castle benefited from the presence of a bustling port town right on their doorstep, while the civilian community outside the walls also profited from the castle, able to provide goods and services to those living inside the historic fortress. Now, people did live here before the first wooden castle was built back in the 11th century, but it was after the fortress's construction that Arundel's star really began to shine. As we approach the top of the High Street here, we encounter some of the most imposing fortifications lining the grounds of the castle, once again built in the mid-19th century as part of that exchange deal with the town. This is the Town Gate, built in 1850, and another of the castle's main developments during the mid-19th century, which was a period that also coincided with a prestigious visit to Arundel Castle by none other than Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert, who came to stay here for 3 days in 1846. But as we look down the path of the new castle walls from up on high, the view over the surrounding countryside brings up an important point. Why was a castle built here in the first place? Well, as you'll have noticed from the hill that we've been climbing up to this point, Arundel is located on a prominent outcrop of land that offers wide views across the surrounding countryside and even towards the English Channel. This made the area an especially ideal place to build a castle, with those wide views meaning that incoming attacks could be seen from miles away, and the river and high ground also provided the perfect natural defences to any would-be assault. And as we can see beyond the town gate, the sprawling castle was extra well defended by its lengthy circuit of walls, which came in very handy on a number of occasions through history, as Arundel Castle fell victim to sieges and wars over the centuries. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, this castle was built by the Normans to serve as a show of power and a way of keeping tabs on the local population and any potential rebellions. But a few decades later, in the mid-12th century, Arundel Castle found itself in the crosshairs of one of the first English civil wars, known as the Anarchy, when King Stephen laid siege to the castle while his cousin and nemesis, Empress Matilda, was inside. Fortunately, the castle escaped major damage on that occasion, although a few centuries later, in the early days of the Civil War between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians, Arundel Castle, initially held by the King's forces, fell to the Parliamentarians after a brutal 17-day siege, after which point many of the castle's oldest defences were destroyed. That's one of the reasons that so much of Arundel Castle today is so relatively new, although if you do venture inside the grounds, you can still see the spectacular Norman motte that belonged to the original 11th century fortress, now situated at the heart of what has become a much, much larger castle. But along the road from the town gate, we've been walking past the buildings of the historic Arundel Priory, a major monastery that was founded all the way back in 1380. Historically much richer and more significant than Blackfriars down by the river, Arundel Priory was situated just on the outskirts of the castle, and it incorporated a walled quadrangle with living chambers for monks, and a brand new chapel, which has since evolved into Arundel's historic Parish Church. This is St Nicholas's Church, built in 1380 along with the Priory, and which remains standing in pretty much the same state today as it did when it first opened its doors all those years ago. Surrounded by a tranquil walled churchyard that bears the actual site of the old Maison Dieu, St Nicholas's Church is an impressive local landmark, but it's also one of the most unusual churches in the entire country, for reasons that we can't quite see while standing here. Though a rather large church for a town of this size, the place of worship that stands in this walled churchyard is actually only half the building. Just on the other side of that wall that we can see just ahead, there stands the Fitzalan Chapel, inside what are now the castle grounds. You might be able to see the wall of the chapel just poking up above the barrier beyond the tower, and it goes to show that it and St Nicholas's here were once upon a time part of the same place of worship. Nowadays the Fitzalan Chapel is no longer accessible through this churchyard, you can only reach it via the castle grounds. But as you can see from this image taken on the other side of the wall, there are but a few inches separating the two. So what happened? Well, in the mid-16th century, King Henry VIII dissolved Arundel Priory, which used to use both buildings for worship, as part of his efforts to establish the Protestant Church of England across the country. St Nicholas's behind us then became the town's Protestant parish church, but the chapel on the other side of the wall came under the ownership of the castle's new owners, the Fitzalan family, who were Catholics. They used the chapel on the other side as a Catholic place of worship, which unusually split the one church into a place of worship for two separate Christian denominations, a split that still exists in the modern day. Now, the Dukes of Norfolk and the Earls of Arundel are the most prominent Catholic family in the English nobility, and that's why this small Sussex town is home not just to their grand castle, but also one of the grandest Catholic cathedrals in the country today, which stands here just a short distance from the walls of Arundel Castle. Originally opened back in 1873, this huge building is officially known as the Cathedral Church of Our Lady and St Philip Howard, the latter being the first Earl of Arundel, who was canonised as a Catholic martyr after his imprisonment and death under the reign of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. As you'll no doubt know, between the reign of Elizabeth I in the late 16th century and the early years of the 19th century, Catholic worship was heavily suppressed across England, and later the rest of the UK. And it wasn't until the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829 that this suppression came to an end, allowing Catholics to legally establish their own churches once again. This mighty building therefore started out life as Arundel's Catholic Parish Church, but it was designed to be a grand and elegant counterpart to Arundel Castle, serving as another symbol of the long association between this town and the Dukes of Norfolk. Later on in 1965, this church was designated as a Catholic cathedral, and to this day it towers over the rest of Arundel along with the castle. In fact, the cathedral and the castle on top of the hill here are easily visible for miles around in the surrounding countryside. With the flag of the Vatican flying high just outside the church's western facade here, this cathedral is one of the most prominent religious symbols in Arundel today, and also well worth visiting when you're in town, on account of its beauty both inside and out. Despite only having opened 150 years ago, Arundel Cathedral certainly has the majesty to match the nearly 1,000-year-old castle a few steps away, inspired by the grand French Gothic style that was popular in church buildings around the country around the time of the 14th century, a period when the Dukes of Norfolk rose to prominence as some of the leading nobles in England. But before this cathedral was built, this area of town, now mostly residential, was once upon a time the very edge of Arundel, the road just here in the shadow of the cathedral, leading away from the High Street and into the wilderness of the South Downs towards London. However, it's also at this northwestern edge of the town that we find another of Arundel's many historic pubs, this one being the St Mary's Gate Inn. The pub takes its name from the historic St Mary's Gate of Arundel Castle, which is located just behind the walls across the road from the tavern. And though it's located on the historic edge of town, this pub is housed in one of the oldest buildings in Arundel, originally built all the way back in 1525 as a thatched farmhouse. Over the years, and as the town grew in size, this building took on a number of different uses, but its position on the London Road made it an ideal place to host people travelling through the area. In fact, in the mid-17th century, the St Mary's Gate even hosted Oliver Cromwell and his guardsmen for a night. It just goes to show then that there's history to be found in every corner of this riveting town. But as we gaze up at the beautiful sunlit facade of the spectacular cathedral, it's here that we've sadly reached the end of our walk around Arundel. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making a visit to Arundel for yourself sometime soon.